My father stopped chewing mid-bite and asked me to repeat what I'd just said. I set my fork down, looked him straight in the eye, and said it again, slower this time. I'm not paying for Spencer's mistakes anymore. By morning, my name had been quietly removed from the family trust, my badge no longer opened the side door of the office, and my mother had already changed the locks on the guest house I'd been living in since grad school. I'm Audrey, 28, and for 6 years I worked as a forensic auditor for a regional bank in Charlotte before my parents convinced me to come run compliance for the family business. Our company, Callaway Hospitality Group, owned a string of boutique hotels across the Carolinas. The kind of place that got written up in Southern Living, the kind of place my parents had built from a single roadside motel into something that made the local business journal twice. To everyone in Charlotte, we were the Callaways, a success story, a black family that had broken into an industry that didn't always make room for people like us. My father, Marcus, liked to remind reporters of that whenever he got the chance. What the reporters didn't know was that inside our house there were 2 daughters, and only one of them mattered. My younger sister Spencer was 31, vice president of guest experience and the undisputed favorite. She'd been homecoming queen, she'd been prom queen, she'd been the one whose wedding got a 4-page spread in a regional bridal magazine. Her husband, Garrett, no, that wasn't right, I'm getting ahead of myself, because by the time any of this happened, Spencer's husband already had a different name attached to a different kind of trouble. His name was Holt. Holt Bremer, 33, white, from an old Charlotte banking family that everyone assumed still had money, though anyone who actually looked at the public filings would have seen the cracks years ago. My parents adored him instantly. He was polished, soft-spoken, knew which fork to use, called my mother Mrs. Callaway, even after she insisted he call her Renata. They made him CFO of the hotel group 18 months after the wedding, skipping over 2 people who'd actually worked in finance for a decade. I was one of them. I didn't say anything at the time. I told myself it didn't matter, that the company was big enough for all of us, that I didn't need the title to do my job well. I was wrong about that, but I didn't find out how wrong until February. It started with a discrepancy so small I almost didn't flag it. A vendor payment to a linen supply company in Myrtle Beach that didn't match any service agreement on file. I pulled the thread out of habit more than suspicion. 6 years of auditing teaches you that the small numbers are where people hide the big ones. Within a week, I had 11 shell vendors, none of them real, all of them routing payments through accounts that eventually landed in something called Bremer Capital Holdings, registered in Delaware, with Holt listed as the sole officer. $420,000 over 14 months. Not catastrophic for a company our size, not yet, but it was bleeding, and it was bleeding because someone inside was opening the vein on purpose. I didn't go to my parents first. I went to Spencer. I sat across from her in her glass-walled office overlooking the lobby of our flagship property, and I laid the printouts on her desk like I was diffusing something instead of detonating it. I told her gently. I told her I knew this would hurt. I told her I wasn't trying to destroy her marriage, I just needed her to look at the numbers with me before this went any further. She didn't look at the numbers. She looked at me, and her face did something I'd seen before, 100 times since we were kids, that particular tightening around the eyes that meant she was deciding how to make this my fault. You've always hated that he makes more sense to Mom and Dad than you do, she said. I told her that wasn't what this was. I told her I had bank statements, wire confirmations, dates that lined up exactly with hotel renovation budgets that had quietly ballooned over the past year. She picked up the papers, and for 1 second I thought she was finally going to read them. Instead, she walked them straight into our father's office and told him I was trying to frame her husband because I was jealous of her marriage. That was the version that got told at dinner that Sunday. Not the part about wire transfers. Not the part about a Delaware shell company with my brother-in-law's name on the filing. Just that I'd accused Holt, that I'd upset Spencer, that I'd embarrassed the family in front of people who didn't need to know our business. My father set down his glass of wine very deliberately. Effect tomorrow, the company will no longer be covering the remainder of your MBA tuition, he said, like he was reading a weather report. Not until you apologize to your sister and to Holt for this. This nonsense. I had 11 months left on that degree. I had already paid for the first 3 semesters myself, working full-time and taking night classes, and the company had agreed to cover the final stretch as part of my compensation when I came on as compliance director. A real, signed agreement, not a favor. I sat there with the unspoken question filling up the room. Did he actually believe Holt was innocent? Or did he simply prefer the version of the story where his golden daughter's marriage stayed intact, and his other daughter just learned to keep her mouth shut? I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I looked at him and said one word, "All right." My mother actually smiled like she thought she'd won something. Spencer didn't look at me at all. I went up to the guest house that night and I didn't sleep, but not because I was devastated. I was doing math. 14 months of falsified vendor records doesn't disappear because a family decides not to discuss it at dinner. It sits in a server somewhere. It sits in bank records that a federal auditor would find in about 4 hours if anyone ever bothered to look. And I had copies. I'd made copies the moment I found the first discrepancy, because 6 years in compliance teaches you that the people who get hurt worst in these situations are the ones who trusted a system to protect them instead of protecting themselves first. By 4 in the morning, I'd packed 2 suitcases and put the rest of my things in storage. I didn't slam any doors. I didn't leave a note. I just left a single forwarding email on the kitchen counter, where my mother would find it with her coffee, the kind of detail she'd remember later and wonder about. I checked into a Hampton Inn off the interstate, the kind of place my family wouldn't be caught dead in, and for 3 days I did nothing but work. I built a timeline. I cross-referenced every wire transfer against hotel renovation invoices, against vendor contracts, against the board minutes where Holt had personally presented cost-saving infrastructure upgrades that didn't actually exist at 3 of our 5 properties. I found a second shell account, this one funneling money toward a personal mortgage on a lake house in Lake Norman that Spencer had posted about on Instagram 8 months earlier, captioned "Blessed Beyond Measure." Like the universe itself had handed them a 4,000 square foot lake house instead of $400,000 stolen from a company built by 2 people who came up with nothing. I am not, by nature, a vindictive person. I want to be clear about that, because I know how this sounds. I didn't want to burn my family down. I wanted, more than anything, for my father to look at the evidence and believe me without needing a federal agency to confirm it first. But you can only ask to be believed so many times before you have to accept that some people will only believe what gets handed to them by someone with a badge. So on day 4, I called the FBI's white-collar crime tip line, and then I called a forensic accounting colleague I trusted from my old bank job, a man named Desmond, who'd moved into private investigation work 2 years earlier, and I asked him to help me build something airtight. Not to destroy my family, to protect it from a man who was actively destroying it from the inside, whether they wanted to admit that or not. It took us 5 weeks. 5 weeks of motel coffee and printer ink and Desmond walking me through chain of custody rules so that nothing I'd gathered could later be dismissed as tainted. I worked my actual compliance job remotely the whole time, badge access or not, because the company still owed me a paycheck, and I wasn't going to give anyone the satisfaction of saying I'd abandoned my post. I went to my night classes too, even after the tuition stopped, paying out of savings I'd built specifically because some part of me had always known my family's love came with conditions I might one day fail to meet. The dossier ended up at 61 pages. Bank records, falsified vendor agreements, the Delaware filing with Holt's signature, the timeline cross-referenced against company board minutes, even text messages Holt had sent to one of the real vendors asking them to backdate an invoice. Messages I'd recovered legally, through records the vendor company itself was required to retain. Desmond looked at the final version and told me something I've held on to since. Most people in your position would have wanted revenge. You built a case instead. That's the difference between getting even and being right. I delivered a copy to the FBI agent who'd been assigned the tip. I delivered a second copy to my father's lawyer, a woman named Janelle who had known me since I was 12, and who, when she finished reading it at 2 in the morning by her own account, called me crying and apologizing for not believing the first version of this story I'd tried to tell at that dinner table. The federal investigation moved faster than any of us expected, mostly because Holt had been sloppy in exactly the ways guilty people often are, too confident no one was looking. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning, walked out of Bremer Capital Holdings' rented office space in handcuffs, while a local news crew happened to be filming a segment on small business fraud 2 doors down. The footage made it onto the 6 o'clock news that same night. My mother called me 11 times before I picked up. I won't pretend the conversation that followed was easy. My father didn't apologize at first. He tried, for almost a full minute, to suggest that I should have brought this to him the right way, instead of going to federal authorities, as though I hadn't tried the right way first and watched it get buried under my sister's tears. I let him finish. Then I asked him a single question: how many more months would it have taken before he believed me without a federal indictment doing the convincing for him? He didn't have an answer. The company survived, barely, after a forensic restructuring and a settlement that returned most of the stolen funds, though 2 of our 5 properties had to be sold to cover the legal costs and the damage to our banking relationships. Spencer filed for divorce within 3 weeks, which I understood, even if the timing told its own story about what she'd really been protecting all along. She didn't speak to me for 4 months. When she finally did, it wasn't an apology so much as an admission, delivered quietly over coffee, that she'd known something was wrong for longer than she'd let herself believe, because believing it would have meant admitting she'd built her entire identity around a man who saw her family's company as a convenient bank account. My parents reinstated my tuition funding without me asking, transferred directly into my account with no note attached, which told me everything about how that particular apology was going to be handled in our family. Quietly, financially, never out loud. I finished my MBA that December. I walked at graduation, and my father came, and he sat in the 3rd row, and afterward he hugged me for longer than he ever had before and said, very simply, I should have looked at the papers. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and I've learned not to require everything from people who are only capable of giving you what they have. Callaway Hospitality Group held its 30-year anniversary gala that following spring, the first major company event since the restructuring, in the ballroom of the flagship hotel I'd personally helped audit back into solvency. I hadn't planned on speaking. My father asked me 3 days before, in front of the board, to say a few words about the company's future, and I understood exactly what that invitation meant, even if he never said it directly. I stood at the podium in the same ballroom, where I used to feel like the daughter nobody photographed for the brochure, and I looked out at 200 people who'd read about the scandal in the business journal and come anyway, because Callaway Hospitality was still standing, and a story like that gets people curious about how. I talked about resilience for exactly as long as the moment required, and then I said the only thing I actually meant. The companies that survive aren't the ones that never have a problem. They're the ones willing to look directly at it, even when the truth is inconvenient, even when it's family. My father raised his glass first. Then the room followed. I caught Spencer's eye near the back, and for the first time in over a year, she didn't look away.